Confusion didn't enter my life as chaos. It arrived disguised as complexity. The world slowly became harder to understand, not because reality changed, but because explanations multiplied until none of them felt solid. Every issue had endless sides. Every truth came with an immediate counter-truth, and certainty was treated as ignorance. At first, I blamed myself. I assumed I wasn't informed enough, smart enough, updated enough. I didn't realize confusion wasn't a failure of understanding, it was the environment I was placed in. Information never stopped coming. News cycles refreshed by the hour. Opinions replaced facts before facts had time to settle. Urgency dominated everything. Every issue was framed as critical, immediate, and emotionally charged. There was no space to process, only to react. Calm reflection felt irresponsible in a world that demanded constant engagement. I didn't notice how my attention was being fragmented, sliced into pieces too small to form coherent thought. Contradiction became normal. Authorities contradicted themselves without consequence. Narratives shifted, then pretended they hadn't. Memory itself was challenged not by force, but by repetition. Say something often enough, and yesterday dissolves. When confusion surfaced, it wasn't addressed. It was blamed on misinformation, bad actors, or personal bias. The system never questioned itself, it questioned you. What made this weapon so effective was that it felt passive. No one told me what to think directly. Instead, I was surrounded by noise so loud that thinking became exhausting. Silence felt uncomfortable. Stillness felt unproductive. The moment confusion appeared, distraction followed. Another headline, another alert, another emotional trigger. Confusion didn't need to be resolved, it only needed to be sustained. I began to notice how emotional responses were guided. Fear here, anger there, relief on cue. Each emotion pushed attention outward, never inward. There was always something to oppose, something to defend, something to fear. A confused mind clings to direction, and direction was always conveniently provided. Confusion made people easier to guide because they were desperate for certainty. This was the first realization that unsettled me deeply. Confusion benefits someone. A clear mind asks dangerous questions. A confused mind seeks guidance. When people don't trust their perception, they outsource it. Authority doesn't need to dominate when it can position itself as the solution to the confusion it helped create. Ideas I later encountered from David Icke reframed this entirely. Control, he suggested, doesn't begin with force. It begins with perception. If you destabilize how people interpret reality, you don't need to tell them what to believe. They'll accept whatever restores emotional balance. Confusion becomes the gateway. Looking back, the signs were obvious, the pace was unsustainable by design, the contradictions were tolerated because they exhausted resistance, people weren't stupid, they were overwhelmed. Overload replaced understanding. Exhaustion replaced curiosity. Confusion replaced clarity. The most unsettling part wasn't realizing confusion was used as a tool. It was realizing how long I had defended it. I mistook overload for depth, noise for knowledge, complexity for intelligence. I didn't realize that the moment I stopped reacting, stopped consuming endlessly, the confusion weakened. Confusion was never random. It was the first weapon. Once confusion took hold, noise rushed in to claim the space where truth used to live. Not silence, never silence, but endless stimulation. Screens filled every quiet moment. Opinions arrived faster than facts. Everyone spoke at once, yet nothing meaningful was said for long. Truth didn't vanish, it was buried beneath volume. When everything demands attention, nothing is examined. I noticed how speed replaced depth. Stories weren't meant to be understood, only consumed. Before one idea could settle, another interrupted it. Context disappeared. Memory shortened. The past became irrelevant because the present was always framed as an emergency. In that state, questioning felt like a luxury no one could afford. Survival required staying informed, which meant staying plugged in. Noise wasn't just sound, it was emotional turbulence. Outrage cycles rotated endlessly. Fear followed relief, relief followed fear. Each emotion demanded a reaction, not reflection. The system didn't need you to believe everything, it only needed you emotionally engaged. A reactive mind doesn't verify, it responds. And response, repeated long enough, becomes habit. What shocked me was how willingly people defended the noise. Silence made them uneasy. Stillness felt suspicious. If nothing was happening, something must be wrong. The absence of stimulation created anxiety. As if awareness itself had become dangerous, people scrolled not because they wanted answers, but because they couldn't tolerate quiet long enough to hear their own thoughts. Truth requires space, it requires patience, memory, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. Noise destroys all three. It fragments attention until ideas lose coherence. Complex questions are reduced to slogans. Nuance is treated as weakness. Simplified narratives survive not because they're accurate, but because they're loud and repeatable. I began to see how noise protected power. When everything is amplified, nothing stands out. When lies and truths share the same volume, discernment collapses. People stop asking, is this true? And start asking, who's louder? Authority no longer needs credibility, it needs reach. This realization aligned with ideas frequently discussed by David Icke. Perception management doesn't require hiding information. It requires flooding the environment so thoroughly that meaning drowns. In that state, truth becomes just another opinion, easily dismissed, easily ignored. I tested this by stepping back, reducing intake, slowing down. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Patterns emerged that weren't visible before. Repetition became obvious. Emotional triggers lost intensity. The noise hadn't been informing me, it had been steering me. Without it, clarity began to return, not as answers, but as coherence. The most revealing moment came when I realized how little of the noise actually mattered. Crises passed without consequence. Outrage evaporated overnight. Yesterday's essential truth was forgotten by morning. Yet the emotional energy expended was never returned. People stayed tired, distracted, and uncertain, perfectly positioned to accept the next wave. Noise didn't replace truth by arguing against it. It replaced truth by making it impossible to hear. And once noise becomes normal, silence becomes revolutionary. The most disturbing realization came when I understood that no one was forcing anything. There were no visible restraints, no soldiers in the streets, no explicit commands telling people how to live or what to believe, and yet behavior was remarkably uniform. Opinions clustered tightly around approved narratives. Deviations were rare, and when they appeared, they were quickly corrected. Control, I realized, no longer needed chains. It had evolved. People complied because compliance felt voluntary. Choices existed, but only within invisible boundaries. You could choose what to consume, but not whether consumption itself was necessary. You could choose your opinions, but only from a narrow range that didn't threaten the structure. Freedom was presented as abundance, while the frame itself remained unquestioned. The cage wasn't locked, it was comfortable. Fear played its role quietly, not fear of violence, but fear of loss. Loss of status, loss of income, loss of connection. Humans are social creatures, and exclusion is one of the most powerful deterrents there is. The system understood this deeply. It didn't need to punish rebels harshly, only enough to make others hesitate. Watching someone be ridiculed, silenced, or erased socially was usually sufficient. What shocked me was how much enforcement came from ordinary people. Friends corrected language. Colleagues repeated approved phrases. Strangers policed opinions online with moral certainty. Authority rarely had to intervene because the population did the work willingly. People defended the rules as if they were defending themselves. Identity had fused with belief, and belief had fused with compliance. Control without chains works because it feels natural. It aligns itself with survival, belonging, and self-worth. Questioning the system feels risky, not because it's forbidden, but because it threatens stability. Most people don't ask whether something is true. They ask whether it's safe to say. That single shift is enough to maintain order indefinitely. This understanding echoed a core idea often expressed by David Icke. The most advanced form of control is when the controlled believe they are free. When people identify with the system, they protect it instinctively. Criticism feels like attack. Awareness feels like danger. I noticed how language itself reinforced this control. Words were softened or sharpened to guide perception. Certain questions became unacceptable not because they were answered, but because they were framed as harmful. Morality replaced logic. Emotion replaced evidence. In that environment, reasoning wasn't defeated, it was bypassed. The absence of chains didn't mean the absence of restraint. It meant restraint had moved inward. People monitored themselves constantly, editing thoughts before they were spoken, dismissing doubts before they fully formed. The guard tower had relocated to the mind. Once I saw this, it was impossible to unsee. Control wasn't imposed from above, it was maintained from within. And that realization carried a quiet terror, because it meant liberation wouldn't come from overthrowing anything external. It would begin with reclaiming internal authority. Control didn't need chains anymore. It had something far more effective. Consent without awareness. The exhaustion didn't come from work alone. That was the first lie I had to unlearn. I slept, but I never felt rested. I took breaks, but my mind never slowed. Even moments of leisure felt crowded, as if silence itself had been replaced by a low hum of anxiety. At first, I assumed this was just modern life, stress, responsibility, adulthood. But the fatigue felt deeper than effort. It felt engineered. I began to notice how rarely the mind was allowed to settle. Even rest was filled with stimulation. Screens followed us everywhere, offering endless content disguised as relaxation. Scrolling replaced stillness. Background noise replaced reflection. The body stopped moving, but the mind never stopped processing. True rest, mental rest, became almost impossible. Emotional exhaustion played a central role. Every day demanded reactions. Crises rotated endlessly, each framed as urgent and morally charged. You weren't just expected to be informed, you were expected to care intensely, immediately, and publicly. Outrage became a requirement. Silence became suspicious. The nervous system stayed permanently activated, locked in a state of low-level alarm. A tired mind doesn't investigate. It accepts fatigue, dulls skepticism, and shortens attention span. When energy is depleted, people reach for the easiest explanation, the safest opinion, the most familiar narrative. Exhaustion becomes compliance without coercion. I realized then that burnout wasn't a flaw of the system, it was one of its most effective features. Attention, I saw, was the real resource being extracted. Not time, not money, awareness. Every alert, every argument, every emotional spike drained it. And unlike physical labor, there was no clear signal when mental reserves were depleted. People pushed past limits without realizing clarity had already faded. The result was confusion layered on top of fatigue, an ideal state for influence. This reframed everything I'd been told about productivity and self-care. The constant pressure to keep up wasn't about efficiency, it was about pace. Slow thinking is dangerous to systems built on reaction. A rested mind asks better questions. A calm mind notices patterns. Exhaustion keeps perception narrow and controllable. Ideas often articulated by David Icke, echoed clearly here. Control feeds on lowered awareness. When people are overwhelmed, they don't resist, they seek relief. And relief is offered in the form of distraction, consumption, and simplified narratives. The cycle sustains itself. I experimented with stepping out of it, fewer inputs, longer silences, less reaction. The change was immediate and uncomfortable. Without constant stimulation, buried thoughts surfaced. Emotions long suppressed demanded attention. The fatigue didn't vanish instantly, but it shifted. It became clearer where the tiredness originated not in effort, but in overload. The most unsettling realization was this: the system didn't need to convince people they were powerless. It only needed to keep them tired enough not to test their strength. Exhaustion ensured obedience far more reliably than fear ever could. The tiredness wasn't weakness. It was the signal, and once recognized, it stopped being invisible. The moment control began to weaken wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no rebellion, no confrontation, no sudden collapse of the world I knew. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, when I stopped reacting. For the first time, I didn't rush to form an opinion. I didn't share, defend, or oppose. I simply observed. And in that pause, small but deliberate, something fundamental shifted. Reaction had been the system's lifeblood. Every headline, every outrage, every manufactured crisis relied on immediate emotional response. Anger, fear, agreement, outrage, any reaction would do as long as attention was captured. When I withdrew that response, even briefly, the mechanism stalled. The message still arrived, but it no longer landed the same way. Without emotional fuel, it lost momentum. I began to see how manipulation worked only when it was invisible. The moment influence was noticed, it weakened. Fear lost intensity when it was observed rather than obeyed. Urgency dissolved when I refused to treat every issue as immediate. The system depended on speed. Slowness disrupted it. Stillness exposed it. This wasn't about resistance, it was about clarity. I didn't need to argue with narratives to see their shape. Patterns revealed themselves naturally once the noise settled. Repetition became obvious. Emotional hooks stood out clearly. The same scripts recycled under different names. Control didn't disappear, but it became predictable, and predictability stripped it of power. What surprised me most was how little effort this required. Control collapsed, not through force, but through withdrawal. I didn't have to change the world, I had to change my relationship to it. When attention stopped being freely given, influence stopped being automatic. Awareness alone altered behavior internally first, then externally. This echoed an idea frequently emphasized by David Icke. Systems of control cannot survive sustained observation. They rely on unconscious participation. Once you see the mechanics, you stop feeding them. The system doesn't fear opposition, it fears non-compliance through clarity. I noticed fear no longer dictated my choices the way it once had. I wasn't fearless, but fear no longer commanded obedience. It became information, not instruction. That distinction changed everything. I could feel fear without acting from it. I could acknowledge uncertainty without surrendering to it. There was a subtle confidence that followed not arrogance, but groundedness. I no longer needed to win arguments or convince others. Truth didn't require defense when it was lived rather than declared. Silence became strength. Observation became power. Control had relied on my participation, and I had quietly withdrawn it. The moment control breaks is not when the system falls. It's when you stop feeding it. Nothing external changed immediately. The world continued as before, but my experience of it transformed. The same messages arrived, but they no longer owned my reactions, and that was enough. The illusion lost its grip, not because it was exposed publicly, but because it was no longer believed internally. Control doesn't end with revolution. It ends with awareness. And awareness, once steady, is very hard to take back. The final realization was the most unsettling of all. Awakening was never part of the design. The system didn't fail when people became distracted, exhausted, or confused. It succeeded. Everything functioned exactly as intended. From constant stimulation to emotional pressure, from manufactured urgency to endless noise, the structure assumed one thing above all else, that most people would never stop long enough to see it. Awareness wasn't suppressed by accident, it simply wasn't accounted for. I understood then why clarity felt lonely. The system isn't built for conscious individuals, It's built for predictable ones. People who question too deeply don't fit neatly into categories. They don't respond reliably to fear. They don't consume endlessly, react impulsively, or outsource their perception easily. Awareness doesn't threaten the system through rebellion. It disrupts it through unpredictability. What shocked me most was realizing there was no final barrier to awakening. No locked door, no hidden gatekeeper. The only requirement was attention, and attention had been scattered deliberately for years. People weren't stopped from waking up. They were kept busy, distracted, emotionally invested in narratives that went nowhere. The system didn't need to block awareness. It only needed to delay it indefinitely. This aligned closely with ideas often expressed by David Icke. Control persists because people wait to be told what is real. Awakening begins when that permission is withdrawn. No authority confirms it. No institution rewards it. It happens quietly, internally, without validation. And that is precisely why it's discouraged. There was no triumph in this realization, no sense of victory, only responsibility. Once you see clearly, you can't unknow it. You become accountable for where you place your attention, how you respond emotionally, and whether you participate consciously or automatically. Ignorance had been comfortable. Awareness demanded integrity. The system continues regardless. It doesn't collapse when one person wakes up. It adapts. It absorbs opposition. It reframes resistance. But awareness doesn't aim to destroy the system. It aims to free perception from it. The external world may look the same, but the internal relationship to it is fundamentally altered. The final choice is quiet and continuous. Return to distraction or remain present. Seek comfort or choose clarity. Hand perception back to authority or hold it yourself. No one forces the decision. No one announces it. You make it daily, often unconsciously. You were never meant to wake up, not because awakening is forbidden, but because it was never necessary for the system to function. And yet, here you are, not awakened by permission, not guided by authority, but aware enough to choose. That is where the story truly ends, and where responsibility begins.